Welcome to the Lure and Blur. I've been saying blur and lure every time I pre-announce this, of the what? The real. I'm sort of conversant in this particular subject because in high school there was a kid who I thought was really fantastic. He's actually appeared at Philoctetes since, and I wanted to be him and started to talk like him and become him and appropriate his personality. And then the smartest kid in graduate school, I also tried to be him. He was that's Rocco, very provocative person. If you try to steal a very provocative person's personality, caveat emptor. People don't buy it sometimes. In any case, before we begin today's program, I wanted to again call your attention. Ed Necessian and I are the co-directors, incidentally. I wanted to call your attention to the show on the wall. A lot of times people come into our space and don't realize that these shows are related to the roundtables. And this show, which was curated by Hallie Cohn with the help of Adam Ludwig, is related both to our we showed a wonderful Joseph Cornell film that he himself made about mourning. And then the show was based upon, these are all assemblage and collage. Particularly take a look at Eric Edelman's piece over there and what he's written about it. And Fred Tomaselli is on the panel, of course, and we're very honored to be showing his works, along with those of Maureen Malarkey, Max Primo, Anne Sherwood Pundyke, and John Talbot, who's right there. And thanks, John, for all your help on this show. Philoctetes, the point about this is also that it obviously relates to today's roundtable on appropriation, because the appropriation was part of the collage endeavor. Just a couple of other announcements. On March 16th, we present a different type of event, an ancient stringed instrument reborn, the angular harp. It should be fantastically interesting. And on that panel, we have Tomoko Sugawara. I've been working on that. She's a leading performer of kugu, the Japanese version of the angular harp, which thrived between 1900 and 1700 BC. And those events are organized by Stephanie Chase of the Celestial Sphere Society. So that should be a really interesting event. And on March 25th, Oberlin dance professor Roger Copeland returns to do a presentation called Dancing in the Dark, Julie Tremor, Oedipus Rex, and the Gaze of Upright Posture. And all of our events are available if you go to philoctetes.org. We record this on a 3-camera setup, so you can see this event later in the week, and they're all on YouTube. We are very grateful. Did you want to say about the incredible gift we got from Tony?
We just got a significant contribution from
Tony Lobier.
Tony Lobier.
Yeah, and we're very grateful for that. We've recently been the recipient of grants from the New York State Council on the Arts in poetry and music, the Department of Cultural Affairs, but we need your help because what's happening is we're surviving on a month-to-month basis. So we're applying for grants. We're thankful to the Templeton Foundation in this regard also, but we definitely need our patrons who have been fantastically generous over the past year in supporting us and keeping us alive. And without further ado, I'm very honored to present David Shields, who's been here before. And David is the author of 10 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the New York Times bestseller, The Thing About Life is That One Day You'll Be Dead. I love that title. And most recently, Reality Hunger, a manifesto. He's the chair of the 2007 National Book Awards nonfiction panel, and he's received a Guggenheim, numerous other awards, NEA fellowships, the Ingram Merrill Foundation Award, a Ludwig Vogelstein Foundation grant, and a New York Foundation of the Arts fellowship. His essays and stories have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, Yale Review, The Village Voice, Salon, Slate, McSweeney's, and Believer. David will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other distinguished guests. So take it away, David.
Okay. Thank you very much. Does everyone have the handout? Because I was going to introduce everyone. This is Barbara Browning. This is Paul Miller. This is John Cameron Mitchell. This is Rick Moody. And this is Fred Tomaselli. I'll be happy to give you a lengthy bio of each of them, but I hope that you all have the handout, and I thought I would perhaps spare us that part. I mean, they are all very amazing artists, but I'm happy to give people's bios, but I thought if everyone has it, I won't repeat that information. No one downstairs have it?
There are people watching downstairs who may not.
Okay. Yeah, I will.
Fantastic.
I'll do a brief thing on that, on each person. Barbara Browning teaches in the Department of Performance Studies at the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU. Her scholarly and ethnographic writing, Samba, Resistance in Motion, and Infectious Rhythm, Metaphors of Contagion and the Spread of African Culture, has experimented with personal narrative and lyrical voice, while her forthcoming novel, The Correspondence Artist, incorporates various forms of, quote, of evidence to substantiate the reality of her fictional characters. She also makes chamber choreographies on YouTube. Paul Miller, also known as DJ Spooky and also known as That Subliminal Kid, is a writer, artist, and musician who lives and works in New York City. His 2008 book, Sound Unbound, follows his award-winning 2005 Rhythm Science. Miller's work has been exhibited at museums throughout the world. He has performed in a wide variety of venues, including the Tate Modern, the Guggenheim, and the Herod Atticus Theater at the Acropolis, and recorded both on his own and with collaborators ranging from Metallica to Steve Reich. His latest CD is The Secret Song. John Cameron Mitchell directed, wrote, and starred in the film Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which came out in 2001, for which he received the Best Director and Audience Awards at the Sundance Film Festival. He was also nominated for a Golden Globe Award as Best Actor. He was executive producer of Jonathan Couette's award-winning documentary Tarnation, which is a film which I teach virtually every year in my graduate course on self-reflexive documentary and the self-reflexive essay. It's a great, great film. His improv-based film Short Bus was released in 2006. He's presently in post-production on Rabbit Hole, starring Nicole Kidman and Aaron Eckhart. He has directed music videos for such bands as Bright Eyes and Scissor Sisters. Rick Moody, in prison black and white over here, is the author of 4 novels, including The Ice Storm and The Diviners, 3 collections of short stories, and a memoir, The Black Veil. His work has appeared in many magazines and newspapers, including The Guardian, The New York Times, Esquire, Atlantic, Harper's, and many other publications. As a musician, his releases include Rick Moody and One Ring Zero, and 2 albums with the Wingdale Community Singers, the eponymously titled first album and its recent follow-up, Spirit Duplicator. His new novel, The Four Fingers of Death, will be published by Little Brown in July. Me, you've heard about me from others. Fred Tomaselli is a visual artist whose hybrid paintings, drawings, and collages have been shown in numerous exhibitions worldwide, including the Whitney Biennial, Berlin Biennial, Lyon Biennial, Liverpool Biennial, and the Site Santa Fe Biennial. Many biennials. Solo shows include the Irish Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art at Philip Morris, the Albright Knox Gallery, Site Santa Fe. His work is in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney and many other places. Tomaselli is the subject of a mid-career survey that originated at the Aspen Art Museum and is currently at the Tang Museum until June 6th. A book that details the last 25 years of his work has just been published by Prestel. So that's a little bit about all these people. Where to start? I thought I would try to generate some discussion by throwing out what I hope are some provocative statements to people and let the lure and blur of the real try to overtake us. We're hoping to have something we're hoping to have a conversation rather than a sort of topic by topic debate. But I thought I'd get us started by quoting from a former student of mine, Brian Christian, who said something. He has a book coming out next year. And Brian said something that I haven't stopped thinking about. And I thought I'd simply quote it to you, and I'd love to hear what any of the panelists think. I think it very much relates to our topic. Brian said, "I'm finding it harder to just, quote, write. The seeking and sculpting of found text or sound have become my primary, quote, artistic function. Actually generating that text or music seems increasingly difficult. Lately, I'll sit down with a blank pad and feel like I really have to dig down deep to get my own voice to come out over the, quote, sample choir. It's a very strange feeling, like a conductor trying to sing over the orchestra, and is, I believe, a fairly new one for artists." So I'm just curious what people think. Do you find him wanting, and just does he simply need to find his own voice more assiduously? Is he on to something? What reactions do people have to my former student Brian's statement?
Well, I think the anxiety of influence is something that has haunted the artist or writer or creative for millennia. Nothing's new there. What's new right now is the ability to immediately find out that there's already several zillion other people thinking the same thing. You could be, in Plato's myth of the cave, or you could be in the Matrix, and you'll still have that same eerie sense of unreality. But it's the creative process right now. I'm tending to find the phenomenon of overload and filtering overload as a writer and artist and musician is something that I have to navigate every day. And so that quote is resonant, but I still feel like right now, at the beginning of the 21st century, the whole economy is based on this information overload. I mean, if you really think about what's tying together the global culture and, the Google of everything, kind of scenario. Yeah, I mean, he sounds like, citizen, netizen of, current moment.
I think every young artist has to sort of get out from under the tyranny of influence, and that it can be that you can become quite paralyzed in the onslaught of these influences. And I know that my work started out with a great deal of doubt, and it was through kind of conceptual strategizing that I was able to sort of work myself out of that doubt by trying to put into my work all the sort of contexts that were around it. And that was really self-conscious. And it was through that initial impetus that I was able to, I think, find a voice. But it was only through this sort of very self-conscious sort of strategizing my way out of the tyranny of influence that I was able to find that voice. And I think it's interesting that it was a young writer who mentioned that. I think that that's kind of endemic to younger creative people trying to figure their way out, And so that I think that that's what you end up doing. I think everybody has to deal with that, no matter what age you're in.
But let's in the same context, like The Economist about 2 weeks ago had a really interesting article on information overload, where essentially humanity now generates more data than it's generated literally since at the beginning of its evolution. Something like, a couple exabytes of data a year. A petabyte, if you keep in gigabyte, if you keep going up in the scale of exponentially. So an exabyte would be enough to describe every star in the universe, not only every star, but the relationships of all the galaxies, the explosion of all the material that's going out to the edge of the known universe, with data. You'd be able to describe the entire quantum structure of the universe with a couple exabytes. And we're sending text messages, and that's that's our data. But when you think about your average kid growing up, I think the video game aesthetic, this idea of density and quotation, it's how people have their creative palette as their basic vocabulary. So when you were saying finding their voice, I don't know. It's like the problem of history right now is that it doesn't go away. It's always documented, always simultaneously available. And essentially, if you're in most of the post-industrialized economies, history is this ever-present editing process. I mean, it's one of the funnier moments for me at the last couple of days was getting back to the U.S. from Turkey and Australia and a couple other spots, DJ all over. It's a long story. But, the whole Iraq war is now the election that's going on. And I now was like, oh, yeah, that right. That $2 trillion fiction, where... And when it's amazing that nobody's compared like the Tonkin Gulf incident to the lack of weapons of mass destruction, or the fact that this election's taking place in a post-Bush scenario in a way that people still haven't connected the dots. It seems like this kind of eerie ambivalence about the truth function of finding those weapons. Remember that the weapons were meant to be the excuse for the war, or like Hitler's use of the burning of the Reichstag. You can always create these kinds of meta fictions, but the more people that sign on to it, the more real it becomes. It seems like that's.
Joyce said history is a nightmare. I think you listen to it.
No, that you're trying to wake up from, yeah. But I guess with these days, you just take Thorazine and watch TV on Fox. Very good.
I was just talking to a kid who's, 21. He's a just sort of self-described freight train punk, I guess. And
A steampunk?
No, freight train punk. Like actually,
Like a hopping on
Hop
freight
on the
trains,
trains,
like
yeah.
hobo punk?
yeah.
Okay.
And he's very smart. And I was, talking to him about what it meant to be his age and growing up with the internet and what do you do now? And he thinks about these things and. His awareness of the fact that there's no real mass movements anymore in terms of even pop culture, art, politics. In his generation, he feels, because it's all so diffused and atomized, and there's a sense of, like you said, it's all been done before. Is it just a simulacrum of something that happened before, like the way that fashion has become just kind of broken down as well in terms of just bursts, and everyone's saying it's back, it's gone, it's back, this is back now and it's gone tomorrow. And what do you do when you're a kid and overloaded with I don't think Iraq war could have happened personally. I think it might not have been able to happen 10 years before when there wasn't an overload of a way of scaring people with information. But I said, well, what do you do how do you navigate it? And he said, well, right now there's no real way to rebel. Street demonstrations after that big one before the Iraq War are kind of gone in terms of being, in people's view of being effective. How do you, people's work is now available at the click of a button, which he described as being difficult to absorb now because it was so available. Looking for an album for 10 years, you listen to it differently than when you can just kind of download it quickly without something physical in your hand. There is something different about. Now, I was really trying to figure out how he navigated this, and he said. Well, the only way now to rebel is to turn it all off, I guess. And I was like, but how do you organize that? It's like, yeah, that's the strange thing. You can't plan that. But he's trying to do it carefully. He turned off. He certainly doesn't watch TV, and he periodically, his way of dealing is to go somewhere to turn it off, to where all the radio waves aren't happening anymore, whether it's another country or somewhere on a train or Puerto Rico or whatever it is that he can do to calm down from it, to kind of take a break from it in order to be able to feel again, in order to let the, admittedly beautiful things that are still being made penetrate. And it was just really interesting to see how hard he was trying to feel these things again, but also how paralyzed he was, being, the epitome of the young guy that is trying.
He still has internet?
He still uses, but he limits it. He doesn't. I don't think he uses Facebook or Twitter. I mean, he's trying to kind of keep it to a few things as opposed to all of the things.
I have to say, I'm somewhat more optimistic about this this moment. I'm the mother of a 16-year-old, almost 17-year-old, who really came of age intellectually in the moment of YouTube and is just, constantly researching things on the internet. And he's a musician, he's a composer and a musician, and he is just a voracious omnivore. And I was thinking exactly what Paul said when the question was first addressed. I was remembering being 17 and being in class with Harold Bloom and hearing about the anxiety of influence and his teaching Wallace Stevens' poem and saying, oh, listen to all the resonances, this is the Romantic Poets, and we can take this back and back. And my sudden sense of this onslaught of echoes and citation that was in the text, and that was a totally liberating, beautiful, fantastic moment for me. And for me, that was great. Of course, it was in the time when that meant going to the library and getting the book and doing the research that way. Whereas for my son, it's all, as we've all noticed, it's very easy to get access to that information. But what I find is that you may think of it as a moment when there's too much information and it's going to be very superficial, but I'm finding that these young people are actually, that have come of age in this moment, are able to really go deep. Like he spent the last week just deep into Fats Waller. Every YouTube video of Fats Waller. I would just like to say for this, for people in the room, if you want to dedicate a week to just listening to Fats Waller, you're going to have a great experience. But that's what he did, and it's deep and it's going to stay with him. A week is not a long time, but that's going to, in terms of his musicianship and what he's thinking about, that's not arbitrary and it's not fleeting and superficial. I think, I'm finding that these kids are actually finding what really speaks to them and going deep with it. So I don't necessarily think that the superfluity of the information means it's necessarily going to be fleeting and
not going to penetrate.
Yeah, I don't know. That's my experience.
In the same context of sort of triangulating between what you both were saying, I'm fascinated with the kind of post-industrial world versus other cultures that are still in emergent kind of situations. So last year and then that last summer, say for example, I took a studio down to Antarctica, which there's no Wi-Fi, it's no, and I did these series of acoustic portraits of ice. I was in Antarctica for 4 weeks. And every blue moon or so, I would be tempted enough to use our group's satellite phone. And I had to call my mom on Christmas, for example, and I was standing off the Weddell icy glacier shelf, like, hi Mom, Merry Christmas, kind of. But that was one of the most remote places I've ever been. And there was nothing that you could possibly say that it was even vaguely connected. But we still had satellite uplink if we needed to. If one of us fell and broke our legs or something through an ice field, you would still have the sense of, like, we could call someone who would maybe show up 2 days later. Can you guys still hear it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the other more stranger remote experience is that I went to an island called Nauru last summer to shoot a film. And Nauru is considered one of the most remote islands on Earth. And a lot of these islands are suffering from rising tides. But the one thing that the island had was almost no internet. So while we were there, there's this a third world style cell phone company called Digicel that specializes in setting up cell phone networks in remote places. And the island got its first cell phone, which for me as an American citizen, coming out of downtown New York, seeing kids gather around somebody with a cell phone, so, like, it was amazing. You're in the middle of the South Pacific, the waters are rising. There's that's
a country that destroyed itself with the phosphate.
Yeah, phosphate sort of
mining.
They strip mine the whole island to the point where a lot of the water rising and all the sort of balancing of the ecosystem is totally shattered. So I was shooting a film there about, it's kind of a metaphor of globalization, but the island was unique in the sense that it didn't have any digital media at all. there was one point on the island where you could sort of get a satellite uplink from the satellite from Fiji, which was, I don't know if anybody out there knows Tuvalu or Kiribati or these kind of weird, they're really remote islands. The only thing the islanders could remember from the 20th century is when the Japanese set up these bunkers and then killed most of the population. But it was beyond that, their whole thing was kind of this strange blank island that had missed most of the 20th century. And when I was hearing your story about the kid who's kind of hopping on trains, you obviously think immediately to me at least Jack Kerouac, and the way that the 60s, the beat poets were still trying to make sense of post-World War II. Where a lot of artists, of course you quoted William S. Burroughs at the beginning of the description.
Right.
The Beats, I think, were America's response to the beginning of this sort of info-colonization kind of issues. If you look at Burroughs or Baraka, Ginsberg's Howe, the poetry coming out at that time, it still resonates, with our current kind of, there's kind of a systemic incoherence. That's what I'm tending to find, because when I DJ out around the world, or if I'm there, William Gibson has a great phrase, and I'll wrap up with this, where he says, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And sampling is about playing with these fragments of time. You're seeking equilibrium from all of these kinds of radically different epochs, and that's what I think we're trying to figure out, is finding equilibrium, maybe. That's just...
When you say DJ around the world, I know you DJ Spooky Birds. Are you literally saying you're DJing around the world?
Yeah, I'm only in New York.
I've seen some of your performance, but I'm just wanting a little amplification for those who don't know you.
I'm only in New York between 5 and 10 days a month, and the rest of the time I'm usually in Europe and Asia, or places like Angola or Brazil, or Vanuatu, like weird, crazy places that electronic music's very popular right now. Hong Kong, Sao Paulo, Luanda, Angola. DJing in New York's kind of boring right now. But the pleasure is, it's funny, amusingly enough, the social of actually being together with people. Half the people in this panel I've met mainly at dinner parties, which is a real pleasure. And that's, again, like beyond the abstraction of information, it shows that we still have a good sense of the, what's this gentleman's name? Durkheim, what he called the social fact, or le fait social. How do we make a creative response out of this kind of... After Bush, I don't want to give Bush any credit for this, but he's probably the most postmodern president we probably could have ever had. It's just like the massive schism between reality, and this is something where you're talking about the reality-based community in your book, and the portrayal of reality, which the Republicans...
Let me read that, perhaps. Maybe I'll read that. It's sort of a very, very well-rubbed passage. It's from, you remember, Ron Susskind's portrait of the Bush administration shortly before the October election of 2000, or the November election in 2004, and an anonymous Bush aide said to Ron Suskind, and this piece was published in the Times Magazine about a week or two before the Kerry Bush election, and anyway, the passage was, people like you are in what we call the reality-based community. You believe that solutions emerge from judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the world really works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. Let me pivot and throw some red meat to Rick Moody here. And I wanted to quote Rick, if I could, a couple passages from Jeff Dyer, who's a writer I very much admire. I don't know if some of you know Jeff Dyer's work. He's a British novelist and nonfiction writer. He's had a huge influence on my own work. A book that I highly recommend of his is a book called Out of Sheer Rage, which is a book about his attempt and failure to write a biography of D.H. Lawrence. And in that failure is an extraordinary book. But anyway, let me just quote a couple passages of Dyer's. These are from his book, from Out of Sheer Rage. He says, I think they're from Out of Sheer Rage. Anyway, it's not crucial what the source is, as we already have have well established. Dyer says, in 1963, Marguerite Yourcenar said, "In our time, the novel devours all other forms. One is almost forced to use it as a medium of expression." And then Dyer says, no more. Increasingly, the novel goes hand in hand with a straitjacketing of the material's expressive potential. One gets so weary watching writers' sensations and thoughts get set into the concrete of fiction that perhaps it's best to avoid the form as a medium of expression. And then a second Dyer provocation that pulls a little bit off what Paul was saying is Dyer saying the following: jazz as jazz, jazzy jazz, is pretty well finished. The interesting stuff is all happening on the fringes of the form, where there are elements of jazz and elements of all sorts of other things as well. Jazz is a trace, but it's not a defining trace. Something similar is happening in prose. Although great novels, novelty novels, are still being written, a lot of the most interesting things are happening on the fringes of several forms. And I'd love to hear, Rick, your thoughts on either or both of those passages. To what degree are you sympathetic? To what degree do you want to push back hard against those?
I really admire Jeff, too. I think he's a great writer. And I think the second quote's from But Beautiful, the book about jazz, not
it actually isn't. It's from
really?
a self-interview that Dyer conducted with himself, as self-interviews often are. And it was up on the Random House website when his book, Yoga for People Who Can't Be, has a yoga for people who are too lazy to do it, or something like that. Anyway, Dyer conducted a self-interview, and that's the interview is from that passage. But then I asked him if I could. Anyway, in the interview, he pretends he's being interviewed by Pantheon, but in fact, he was interviewing himself. And I asked him in my book, because I quote him, this passage is quoted in my book, Reality Hunger, if I could say that this is I guess I'm letting the cat out of the bag here, but I asked him if I could say, that basically Dyer was creating a fiction and pretending to be interviewed by someone else when he was actually interviewing himself. Anyway, Jeff said thanks, but no, that he wanted to preserve the fiction of the self-interview. But anyway, that's slightly relevant in a tangential way. But anyway, I'd love to hear you play with those passages.
All right, since we're talking about what's real and the truth, let's say that you and I are old friends, and we already know what each other thinks about all this stuff.
Partly. I mean, I saw your blog on Rumpus Room, and but I mean, I sort of know what you think, but not entirely. Like, I don't know to what degree you are. You've been, you've read a galley of my book, and as a novelist, you gave a very generous response back to it, where you said something like, I like, this book is interesting even when I disagree violently with it, I thought, which was just a really generous and big-spirited response to it. And no, truly. But I don't know, I obviously suspect you'll want to push back against these passages, but I'm not sure to what degree, because the parts of your work that I love the most, as you probably know, are those moments in which a rupture or fissure appears, like one of my favorite things you've ever written, whose title might be temporarily escaping, that incredible meditation on your sister's death. It kind of takes place between a fiction and a story. And apparently some editors or whatever of yours said, oh, no, this is bad when you become self-conscious about blurring the line. It's the very blurring that makes that work explode for me. And, parts of Black Veil that do that, parts of other parts of your work. I mean, to me, you're a novelist, a fiction writer who often is gesturing toward the rupture between form. And so it's not as if that you're dug in by any means as a traditional novelist.
No, that's true. I mean, what I like about Jeff Dyer is that he doesn't believe that genre exists in some functional way, and I don't either. So what's interesting to me about the discussion is that I'm not sure from a literary point of view if I agree that the real exists. So it's hard for me to prefer nonfiction over fiction. I can't make that leap. And to me, that's why there's so many problems with nonfiction books these days from a realistic point of view or a factual point of view, because I don't actually think that literature is terribly good at telling the actual truth. And I think sort of when writers get involved with language, the language does what language does, and it itself is not terribly concerned with truth-telling or not truth-telling. It's concerned with language, you know. Usually when I'm talking about it, what I say is that literature is like the Big Bang in that it precedes genre and it happens at a moment before the fundamental forces exist, physically speaking, and that gesture doesn't contain fiction or nonfiction or poetry or playwriting. It just has language as its impetus, you know.
I actually agree with everything you said, and I'll explain why later, but go on.
But I want to sort of give a parable to really talk about what I think about this stuff, and it relates back to your students' comment, which is that I was up at Vermont Studio Center, I think it was like 05 or something, and Grace Paley came up to read. Grace Paley, the great short story writer and poet and activist. And it was one of the, I think, among the last readings she gave, because she was really ill at the time. And she gave this reading, and it seemed to be a 100% true account of her parents, I think it was her parents, it might have been her grandparents, emigration to the United States, way back, you know. So it was drenched in a kind of genealogical impulse and a truth-telling impulse, a desire to get down some family material while she had time and so on. And the people who were there got to hang out with her a little bit afterwards. And she's someone I admired personally as well as a writer. I admire her work immensely. And one reason I admire it is because it doesn't seem to have much concern about where it sits literarily, you know. So we were sitting around with her. I think she was in a lot of pain because she wasn't talking very much. But someone said, "So what are these things that you read tonight? What are these?" And she sort of thought about it for a while. People were sort of saying, well, it must be nonfiction because of this, it must be fiction because of this or that. And she said, they're all just stories. And, you know, so the question with respect to what we're talking about here is, what does that mean? What does stories mean sort of taxonomically, you know? But I think what she meant is that there's a narrating impetus in the human animal, and that narrating impetus happens from the heart, for lack of a better word, whatever you want to call that, from the emotions, from the passions, and we can sit here all day and talk about digital culture and all that kind of stuff, but you know, longing and the imagination and sort of real primitive levels of human consciousness and experience need to get aired out somehow. Yeah. And no matter how taxonomically you describe them, they're still going to happen. So for me to say that the very title of the panel, in a way, would be something I resist, because it's obscuring this very primal gesture and the absolute necessity of this primal gesture, which is for voices to speak and to try to describe what it feels like to be human and so on. I still love fiction, and I believe totally in fiction to what that popularly refers to, what that word popularly refers to, because I really still believe in imagination. So for me, your student is lazy.
Can I ask, David? Can I ask quick one samplification here, because there's certain, and when you say it's all story, like take someone like I was associating to Bolano, who makes it's a character named him in the work. And yet, isn't there a difference? I mean, you have a character, you have someone making a fictionalized characterization of themselves. There is still some fine points in this whole technical argument.
Yeah, I like the conversation too. I could sit here all day and we could split hairs about. I know he's going to mention Zaybald later, and we'll have to talk about Zaybald,
exactly.
Whether Zaybald's true, and I love Zaybald, but I actually think that it's kind of fitting angels onto the head of a pin a little bit, that the storytelling impulse includes all these generic distinctions. And the other part of it is, not to completely skew the conversation, capitalism wants us to talk about genre. Bookstores want us to talk about genre. And genre is really a bookstore question, not a literary question for me. And I think when I hear about digital culture, what I think about is that, that Google sent some spy to make us talk about this. So that's actually such horse shit, and we really shouldn't talk about it because it's just big corporations trying to get us to talk.
But we're ritualists anyways. We like to have all this kind of
in the same context, taxonomy. One of my favorite recent sort of hybrid works is William Kintridge's The Nose, where last night he was talking about this idea of the grammar of an action. And he does animation. He draws everything usually by hand, and he's trying to branch out to do these operas. Now, if you go back to some of the more recent films dealing with similar things, what you're talking about, I love the adaptation, all puns intended, of the Ang Lee project with you. But there's also, say, for example, Ricky Gervais's The Invention of Lying, or Spike Jonze's film, The Adaptation, where everyone's kind of going back and forth in this story, and the idea of a scripted space. That's capitalism right now, especially late capitalism, I wonder how late it is, really, coming into it. But
it's too late.
Yeah.
Way past midnight.
How do we, people like stories, right? It's part of the basic fabric of what it means to think about textuality. And one of the things as an artist, I'm always looking at is the idea of writing with sound. If you go back to the root word of phonograph, it simply means phonetics of graphology, or writing with sound. So if you look at how people, if you go back to Hammurabi or something in the first code of the city, or when people are trying to figure out all this early Greek myths, or again, to go to Antarctica, the Greeks never went to Antarctica. They never even went to the Arctic. It just was the Arctic was the side of the bear of this one constellation that they assigned it to a story, and the Antarctos was the opposite of the bear, in a story. So if you're sitting on a glacier field in Antarctica, and you're wondering how the hell did the Greeks name this place, it's they'd never been there. It had nothing to do with anything remotely close to their cultural, nice chilling out on a Mediterranean island. But they were able to describe a cultural space that they'd never been to. And I think stuff like that is really intriguing. The role of storytelling is incredibly powerful, and this is something that I think your film spoke to, and same with Hedwig, is how, for 21st century purposes, we're looking at these, again, to go back to that William Kintridge moment, the grammar of the moment, or the grammar of an action. The taxonomy issue that you're talking about, people putting everything in these categories, the playlist mentality, the Amazon, what they call collaborative filtering of taste, the way that you're mathematically, algorithmically assign various values to everything you do online. If you're shopping and you buy 2 books and then those recommendations come up, that's an algorithmic process. And the funny thing is that people tend to get, like you said, lazy, and then respond to that, and it keeps feeding you, and you become a kind of a self-referential loop of taste. And I've tended to find one of the most annoying things with cafes these days is they always have this annoying, lounge, chill-out music, which for me as a DJ drives me nuts. I'm like, why don't they get a real DJ and somebody playing in the background at every cafe, instead of putting on a friggin' iPod? But the playlist aesthetic it's going into writing too. That's what the whole Kindle and it seems like the industry, like you're talking about this Google and Amazon. I'm trying to figure out this kind of breakage points and where new voices, they're always there. It's just how do they cut through the fog,
I just wanted to mention that because Paul mentioned his trip to Antarctica, one of my characters actually accompanied Paul to Antarctica. And yes, one of my characters in my forthcoming novel. Well, I should say something about this, because since the panel is about the real, and in a sense, we were discussing in the room who knows each other's work, and because my novel is forthcoming, nobody knows my novel, so it's not real. So the real of the, it's quite abstract. But I will tell you this, that it does reference a number of real people, and in fact, Paul is a friend of one of my characters, Duong Van Binh, and I've been blogging recently about.
Okay.
I've been blogging recently about. I told you. I've been blogging recently about this particular character. And I think that's part of why Francis thought that this might be an interesting thing to draw into the conversation. But
blogging what?
I'm blogging on the site of the press that the book will come out
Under
with.
your real name?
Under my real name, about my character Duong Van Binh, who
Who's
has
going to Antarctica with me.
He went.
I then went and looked him up, thinking he was real.
Well, he does have a YouTube page. He's got a Yahoo, email address. He's got a whole thing going on. And in fact, he posted a video of me reading from the book on his YouTube page and so on. But what I wanted to say is actually the question of whether or not. Okay, so obviously, in some ways, it interests me, this question of how digital media and the superfluity of information is changing the way that we think about novelistic writing, but also the relationship between real people and fictional people. And what I did was I actually offered Paul this, you may not remember, but I offered him the opportunity to actually deny any real association with my fictional character, and I offered this to several other people that I mentioned in the book who also speaking of dinner parties, go to dinner parties with my characters, and I sort of stalked Slavoj Žižek, and I told him if he wanted to, he might want to say that, in fact, Santuce Echeverria was a figment of my imagination, and they never went to a dinner party together, and he didn't write me back. Some people were actually very friendly. Paul, I won't say what Paul's response was, but he's been super generous in relation to anything that I've talked to him about the book about. But this question of whether this moment represents a different moment for thinking about the relationship between the real and the novel. For me, I'm interested in some of this, what the digital moment and access to information does to that. But I immediately, when I saw the topic of this, I immediately think the relationship between reality and fiction, Cervantes. I'm just like, okay, Don Quixote, what does it mean not just to bring reality into fiction, but to bring fiction into your life and live life as though you're living in a novel, which is really old and pops up at very interesting moments in literary history and all kinds of diverse places. And when Paul said, it's interesting to think about distribution of information and how different it is in different parts of the world. Another story that I mention in my novel that I think is really interesting is the story of my former colleague Ngugi wa Thiong'o, great Kenyan writer who wrote published a book called Matigari in 1986, which was an indictment of Daniel Arap Moi's government, but it was a satirical novel about repressive regime. When he published the novel in Gikuyu, which is unusual, and people were talking about this character, who was a politically resistant character, so much that Daniel Arap Moi put out a warrant for the arrest of the character. And that just...
That's great.
It's great, yeah, it's amazing. And so it's been happening for a long time in different ways, in different historical moments in different parts of the world, but it's not really strictly of the moment, although this moment offers certain interesting ways for us to play with it.
But in the same context, that's where Marshall McLuhan, I have to admit, I'm going back to McLuhan on a lot of this stuff recently, because actually I have his records. I collect records. I'm a fanatic record collector. And he did this really rare, it's very hard, if anybody out there, I think records are going to outlast CDs, because CDs are just basic data files anyway. But vinyl, has this kind of fetish quality, because of the cover and the artwork. So in my book called Sound Unbound that I just put out with MIT, we tracked down the guy who invented the record cover sleeve. And he's still alive. He's about 108 or something. But his name's Alex Steinweiss. And he's like, he has a kind of an old Jewish Brooklyn voice. It's like, record covers used to just be blank. And I was like, You know, if you think about the revolution in graphic design, that this idea of going into a record store and looking at the overload. I mean, any really, like Amoeba Records on the West Coast, we don't have it. It's such a great record store.
So weird, it's gone.
I know. All these record stores are closing. We need to make a record store preservation society, maybe. I don't know. But going to Amoeba Records, for me, is one of my all-time favorite little experiences. If you're ever in San Francisco on the Upper Haight, just a half-block long record store. And so this guy, he's like, one day I came into the office and said, why don't we put an image on the record cover to tell everybody what the sounds looked like? Which is a great, very fun, quirky.
Crazy idea.
Yeah, crazy idea for 1927 or 30 or, So the idea of, if you try this experiment, go through your record collection and try and imagine what all the sounds, on the records are based on the image, on the cover. So I had Carla McCormick interview him. He's one of the main editors for Paper Magazine, great guy. And they got into the sprawling metaphysics of the image of sound, which I think we're now going. McLuhan's whole thing was that the idea of the acoustic space of modern media. I think there's something to, this is where Borges meets kind of like a couple other, the idea of moving into the fictional space, Ballard is one of my all-time favorite writers, and he had this great phrase where he says, history is a stage that needs to be swept clean. And I love Ballard precisely, if you ever look at his novels like High Rise or Empire of the Sun, where he's been taken out of his own context as a white British, Australian, so on, connection, put in a concentration camp that was maintained by the Japanese.
Yeah.
And that was one of his more formative experiences of being ruptured, taken out of context, literally. And there's something to be said for, right now, the narrative of places and things like Guantanamo versus the eerie quality of the prison industrial complex and the way that it's kind of scripted our social spaces right now. I think personally that comparing Guantanamo to these ideas of the scripted space that we inhabit and places where your credit card defines you, the prison cell of taste of the playlist, all these sort of qualifying algorithmic, kind of structures we're putting on ourselves. It's very 1984 meets Keystone Cops, kind of, your taste is being prescripted for you, and, forget Orwell. I mean, we're going even, when you look at, for lack of a better word, maybe these are too many historical collage things going on, but as an artist, I'm celebrating the fact of incoherence, but at the same time, if you look at Burroughs' writing, I can't think of more of a 21st century theme than something like The Prisoner. Do you know this book, The Prisoner? Patrick McGoohan. There's a very famous 60s novel where this guy wakes up and everyone's a number. And he keeps trying to get out of the village, and he's having amnesia, and everything is simulated, and everyone's just a number, and they're all trying to find number one in the village. It's just, he's one of my favorite actors. I kind of missed that TV show. It was great, 60s. I got the DVD box set a while ago. But anyway, so when I triangulate between what Rick was talking about, this idea of taxonomy, and some of the other things we've been talking about, the rise of categories, the category of the real or the category of the blur, it's maybe we should need to think about post-realism or something. I don't know. How do we get out of the trap of real?
Well, I'm going to try and push us toward, because what I hear us talking about so far, I hear, again, it's probably a broad strokes, but I hear sort of Rick and Fred, I think, talking a little bit about preserving space of what feels like sort of pure imagination, of pushing back against the culture of belief in story. And then I hear other people, like say maybe Paul and Barbara and me to a certain extent, arguing for somehow insistence on a penetration of the imagination with the real. There's a phrase that keeps coming to mind for me. It's something I mentioned in my book. I don't even remember if it's my line or someone else's, but the line is, the mimetic function has been replaced by manipulation of the original. And that line haunts me. I don't even know who said it. I think it's some odd collage. And I think it's almost like either you believe on some degree in the mimetic function, or I would push back. I would tend to say, I don't find that my student is being lazy. I think he's thinking really hard about the issues. He's trying to be an artist in 2010 and not an artist in 1910. He's trying to be true to the culture in which he's actually living and trying to work with it and not to escape into a prelapsarian form. I think that I believe in the imagination. I believe in storytelling, but I believe in them. I don't believe in naive storytelling. an awful lot of gestures of traditional art, say in film or in fiction, seem to me to not know how to grapple with the confusions and multiplicity and contradictions of contemporary culture, and they retreat into, to me, pretty antiquated forms. I think a good way to shoot the gap maybe is through John's film Short Bus, and I would love to have you talk about it, whereby
I was just thinking about sex.
whereby, I don't know how, some people would know it. This is the Psychoanalytic Institute. We are all thinking about sex pretty much all the time. But
Are you my father?
John, we'll deal with it later, okay? I don't want to deal with that now. But the point being, before I was so rudely interrupted, was that Short Bus, I think, is a film in which you wanted to explore, in my understanding, the nature of sex and power. And instead of telling it in a kind of, I'll find my own voice, you found the only way you could find your own voice was by hearing a chorus of other voices. And I would love to hear you talk about how that was the gesture available to you. And I would love to hear you talk about Short Bus a bit.
Well, Short Bus was fun because I was interested in how sex seemed, like you said, seemed to be everywhere, but the language of it wasn't always used in cinema. It's been used in other forms, photography more comfortable. I think cinema was the scariest place to examine it in a fuller way because maybe some people mistake cinema more for literal reality than some other forms. And you can be more metaphoric in other forms. So, and growing up very Catholic, it was interesting to me. So I thought...
What was interesting because you grew up...
Well, because sex was bad.
I see.
The first memory I had was my grandmother finding me naked in a park, taking my clothes off, and it was very bad. So it was interesting.
I think she was right.
She was right. It was, yeah. So I thought if there's, but what was fun about that is investigating that and seeing where that might go dramatically required a certain way of working that could change how I was working too. So it was exciting to think of, well, movie stars don't have sex, they have children, and they adopt them, and they talk about it. But so that wasn't going to happen. Professional actors don't usually have sex because they want a sitcom. So how and people involved in such a process are going to be nervous. So I want them to be the co-writers, so they can create their safe environment within which they can examine this dangerous area for what it means to them. And if you can have Hitchcock make all these metaphors for sex, fun metaphors, trains going into tunnels and things, then imagine you can actually show sex, and then that the sex itself can be a metaphor for a train. Or you know what I mean? You can use all the visual things that happen in sex to be metaphors for things in other parts of the people's life. So we kind of created a process of writing the film, which was we had an open call for people to send in audition tapes. And anyone could be part of this, because I knew we'd be working in a slightly more improvisational way, and they wouldn't need to be very trained actors. So we had I was like, well, how do we get people to find out about it? So I solicited various magazines and alternative weeklies to say, you want to do an article about this in return for, talking about our website audition process. So, the LA Weekly and the Stranger and stuff like that. And we got about 500 tapes, and I encouraged people to talk about, we had a website with somebody blowing themselves or something just to show them of, this is a metaphor. Every guy, at 14 tried to get his dick in his mouth, and what is that about? a time saver, or is it, or is it really an interesting metaphor for self-fertilization and like self-sufficiency that usually ends in, yeah. So that was the image on the website, to just let people know where we were going, and if they were scared of that, to not do it. So, and I encouraged them to tell a story about a sexual experience that was very emotionally important to them, so they knew I wasn't just talking about making porn, where the emotional is not the priority. So we got the most interesting auditions ever, from people who really thought of it as, I'm going to be a porn star, to people who were thinking it very intellectually, and other people who were just making little short films of them having sex with their lover, to people talking about abuse, people talking about addiction, and people talking about, saving the world through orgasmic energy. And it became very clear about 40 of those people were really interesting. I wanted charismatic people that had a sense of humor. And they all flew themselves to New York. We didn't have any money. And I had a party for them. Because when you get called back, you never really get much except another audition. So I was like, I'm going to have a dance party for everybody. And they all meet each other, and we're going to have a spin the bottle game with 100 people. With a big bottle. And a T-square to find out where it was aimed. And then people were making out, and it was all cross-generational, cross-sexual, and cross-gender. And it was like, let's have fun. And then chose 9 people from that, and we still had no story. And their audition tapes were starting to give me ideas for the story. And then their auditions themselves, which were improvised, gave me ideas for the story. So by the time they were cast, I kind of had a vague story, and later 2 people dropped. So this was over 2.5 years that we developed it. And it was so fun to get to be really good friends with your actors, because usually you have one day with Nicole Kidman before you shoot. And in this case, we could sometimes rehearse the sex and see how that felt, which was very nerve-wracking, more for me, because I wanted a camera to legitimize it, instead of just watching a sexual improvisation. But one example of how the real and the unreal came together, because I didn't want them to play themselves. I wanted them to use parts of their experience, exaggerate them, and then create a character, create a name, create a background, but they were not allowed to be themselves. Because as soon one actor refused to make the person into a character, she said, my character is me. And she self-destructed after a point, because I wasn't making a documentary. I needed to put her into a context of a narrative, and she resisted that because that's not me. And I'm like, well, I don't want it to be. I want it to be someone else. But she was too interesting. She should have made her own film, which she will. But 2 of the guys were boyfriends, for example. And I was like, how can I exaggerate an element of your relationship and put it into a context of a narrative where you guys feel comfortable, but also it's not you. So let's try an improv where you're meeting for the first time. You're a former child star and doing research to play a prostitute in a TV movie, and you're a real prostitute, and you're meeting, and this is your improv, and your goal is to find out how to play this role, and your goal is to have sex with this guy. And the improv was going really well, and they were a couple already, and I said, it may eventually become sexual, this scene. And I was really nervous about it. It was the first time we were doing this. And it was just me and them. And they were friends, so it was okay, but it was still nerve-wracking. And the scene was going well, and it's like one guy's, talking about his child stardom, and the other's, was a drug addict and street hustler in Santa Monica Boulevard. And the scene was going really well, and then they started to have sex. Because that's where their goals went. And it was like, oh God, is this going to happen? It's happening now, and it seems to be working. That they're actually having sex. The scene is, and I'm watching, and I'm like kind of, and then I'm yawning. Because their story was the goal had been reached dramatically, and I realized, oh right, sex in and of itself is not interesting. They have to have some conflict now. For porn good sex might be interesting to watch because you can project stuff onto it. But what I'm really looking for in this film is bad sex, because that's interesting and funny. So I said, let's pause, but stay in the moment, and I'm going to whisper to each of you new goals and instructions. So I whispered to one, and they were in mid, clinch, and I whispered to one, and I was like, you need to come as soon as possible. That's your goal. And then to the other, I said, if anyone touches your left nipple, think of your mother.
Oh.
And continue. And suddenly, even to someone who didn't know what I was saying, it was like, what's going on here? There's suddenly, it was funny, it was interesting, there were secrets. Mother, why is he trying so hard? And I realized in that was where our story was, or our language to tell the story of the film, was all this bad sex and what the sex, the metaphor for whatever was happening in their life. And they cooperated. Some people freaked out because it was too real and they couldn't handle it anymore and dropped out, which hurt my feelings because we'd been working for 2 years. And then the others trusted me and used part of their lives that were very real stuff, but exaggerated, put it into a context, and in the end, we're all still really good friends.
That's fantastic. I want to quote a brief passage by Steve Martin, the actor and writer and performer and musician. It'll pull off of that. And then I want to quote a passage from Jenny Gage, the photographer, to bring in Fred, I hope. Steve Martin was being interviewed by a New York Times reporter in conjunction with the publication of his first novel, and the reporter and Martin happened to be in a bookstore, I think, sort of doing the interview, and Martin turned to the reporter and said, "That person over there, he's doing one thing, thinking something else. Life is never false, and acting can be. Any person who comes in here as a customer is not phony. Whereas if a guy comes in posing as a customer, there might be something phony about it. And the reason it's phony is that he's really thinking, how am I doing? Do they like me?" I love that passage, and it captures for me a spirit of contemporary art that is fully aware we can't get to the real, is fully aware that the real is a fiction, but there's an energy found in work that has the temerity and the nervous-making energy to somehow try to get there. That interests me a lot. I'm not sure I'm saying it quite the way I want to, but I want to go to, do people know Jenny Gage's photographs? They're quite highly sexualized. And this was an interview that she did with Heidi Julavets at The Believer. And she said, "Usually I'm pretty honest. I say I'm doing a series of portraits of young women, and I want to do one of her, for instance, a particular person. I explain that it's about her, but it's also about myself. And the tension," this sounds like exactly what John was saying, "and the tension this creates. I look at her, seeing myself in her, and also being really into the character that she is in real life. A character that's based in truth, but a character that is also prompted by the fantasy that the photographs project on her. I would rarely use an actress to play the role of a drifter, nor would I go and find an actual homeless girl, but there are elements of these characters in the person I find that I'm really responding to and that I want to preserve through the photographs." And this is the part that interests me the most. She goes on to say, "I've never been completely straightforward. I like work that frustrates me. I don't like things that are spelled out. And whenever I feel like I'm spelling things out too easily, I'll back away and try to make it confusing for myself." So, Fred, you often bring in stuff from reality. You sort of rip it from its context. And I guess I'd love to hear if you have any thought that you're not a photographer per se, but
Right.
Yeah. Does Jenny Gage interest you at all here at all in any way?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to, it kind of makes me think about this sort of, we've talked about this sort of onslaught of information that we're all having to deal with. The fact that all this information is falling down on our heads are still the same size as they were before. We can only comprehend as much as the cavemen did. I mean, basically, we can only consume so much. And I think, what she seems to be referring to is a sort of kind of a post-ironic sort of sensibility, where, I sort of feel like that, we live in this age of artifice and this blurring of reality and this sort of onslaught of irony. And I think that, to kind of talk about a little bit about what Rick was saying, I think that, there is a place where the post-ironic can exist, where we can look upon it as a pre-existing condition, and we can manage that, and we can find within this sort of context of this blurring of the real something that's authentic about ourselves. And even if I'm, for instance, say, working with this sort of the chorus of other artists and writers in my work, I almost feel like I'm the sort of conductor
Sure.
of these images that I sort of grab off the net. And there's all these invisible authors, and there really is this chorus of other voices in my work, and I acknowledge that. But I still feel that one can still find within that, as directors, we have the largest voice. There are these voices, but then we, in turn, sculpt those images, or in my case, images, and we turn those things into something that says something about who we are as individuals.
Definitely. That's clearly implied. Absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm not implying that we're some sort of camera-like apparatus. That bores me completely.
Right. And so I think that within all of that, within all of this artifice and all this mirroring, there is this sense of a real point of view and real emotions that can come through. As I was talking about in my earlier work, it seemed to be very self-conscious. And I think if the work has grown in any way, shape, or form in the years since I started this project of mine, is that I've become less self-conscious about my influences and about this sort of this sort of onslaught of imagery, and have become more intuitive and less and more kind of letting my real life, whatever that is, seep into my work. And so it's an interesting thing, but it is no longer concerned as much as it was before with its own artifice, even though it is, in fact, entirely built upon artifice.
There's a great phrase for some reason I think of. One thing I want to ask you guys, is there a certain point at which you want us to break, say at 4, and open for questions? Is that about right? Okay. So I think we're at about 4:15 or 10:04, so in 10 minutes, I'm sure we'll have all these things completely resolved. I think of this line from Conrad's Lord Jim. He says, there's a phrase that's always stayed with me, in which, I can't remember the exact context, but he says, in the destructive element, immerse. And again, not to cartoonize the positions, but there's a certain sense in which, to a certain degree, I and Barbara and perhaps Paul are saying, in the destructive element, immerse. That we live in this digital, web-based, electronic culture that's just this wash of information and data. And in that destructive element, immerse yourself. Don't be the young person that John knew, and tried to detach himself. I was appalled by that. I was like, no, don't detach yourself. This is the culture that you live in. The only possibility that you have a chance of making timeless art is to write art very much of your time. We cannot exist.
You actually believe that?
Absolutely.
That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard in weeks.
Absolutely. How...
There is no time. There's no anything. The kid on the rail is as much a part of now as as the digital guy. It's all permitted. All those things are permitted. Digital stuff is just one manifestation of what's happening. There's no now. There's no digital anything. That's just another story that someone's telling. So let's let them all happen. And the kid's just as good as the digital guy.
Sure, but he's less likely to create art that speaks to his time.
Like Henry Darger was not likely to make great art because he was alone in his little garret.
He was pulling text from every text that came through his entire life. I mean, Henry Darger was deeply connected to the culture, as was Joseph Cornell.
I don't think you can argue that Henry Darger was deeply connected to the culture.
Everything he was taking was ripped from the tabloids of his time.
He wasn't reading them carefully. Some people think he was retarded.
He was transforming them into art.
Some people think he was retarded, David.
It doesn't really matter. He was deeply immersed in the culture and media of his time.
No, he was not deeply immersed. He was about as immersed as a guy with a pair of scissors is immersed.
James Joyce said, "I am quite content to go down to posterity as a scissors and paste man. I'll take that line to my grave."
I love hearing the take.
We like each other a lot.
Yeah.
We really do. I admire David, and I'm old friends with him.
Likewise.
And by the way, I don't want to be
It's
viewed
all
as
just,
the
it's all
digital
just a
guy
fiction.
here.
We're just trying to create drama.
Friends that killed each other.
Yeah. When you're talking about digital narrative, it's something that really we need to establish context. And in fact, I think one of the common denominators we're all hearing is there's a very uneasy tension between context and content. Is that maybe...
Say again, Paul.
Well, a tension between context and content. If you're talking about someone's deeply connected just because they have a pair of scissors and they're wading through the media of their era, or if they have a reasonably good, web browser and they're just drifting through all the different Google links, there's still a kind of a narrative of selection, and I think that is something that is very important right now. Selection processes, filtering. When you were talking about the scene where I was trying to imagine, was there a camera at all, by the way?
When I was first
rehearsing.
No, I thought that would be intrusive so early.
But you were whispering in their ear.
So
I know. I wanted a camera to make myself separate myself from them, but
because you're playing the role.
It wasn't time for that yet. The camera came later.
Does anybody here check out Ziga Vertov stuff? Man with the camera. His earlier stuff was even
something on him here.
We have to talk. I spent several weeks in Moscow and in St. Petersburg going through their archive. It's a crazy long name. It's called the Russian Museum of the History of Soviet Cinema. And his whole thing was to get rid of the idea of actors and that everyone who the camera's gaze crossed was an actor in the film without consent, without
Greatest film of all time.
Yeah, it's a brilliant film.
Yeah.
But his earlier stuff.
The Man with the Camera?
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. Kino Glas is actually... Well, he was also copying Walter Ruttmann, which is this German filmmaker who did this thing called Berlin Symphony of a City in 1927. But his earlier stuff, it's called Kino Glas, just the cinema eye in Russian. I really am a big fan of that film, so I went to Moscow, got a chance to check out the archive. And one of the things that Stalin feared most was the fact of being able to have reality erupt into this grand narrative that they were constructing. So if you crossed him, for example, he would be erased from the photographs. And the idea of manipulating the recall of the communist system was something that was profoundly shocking for them at the time. So I'm very intrigued with the failed narrative of the Soviet kind of notion of realism, and the fact that as the revolution became this kind of Stalin's personal party. All puns intended, come to think of it. Trotsky, is one of the people that was trying to figure out, okay, here we have this eruption of new forms. We have film. We have new forms of storytelling. The Russians' beginning, the revolution was amazing. If you think of all the art that came out of it. And meanwhile, the decadent Western, in the 1920s, we had F. Scott Fitzgerald, we had jazz, Duke Ellington, and so on. But the Russian constructivists, the approach of early compositional structures from everybody from, Shostakovich later on, or Prokofiev, the way that they were trying to figure out a revolutionary thing was really, to me, a very intriguing moment in 20th century culture. But the manipulation of photographs and manipulation of film is probably what I think will be most remembered personally. Like, if you look at Vertov and then fast forward to people like Tarkovsky and all the kind of alternate visions that came out of that. Anyway, me hanging out in Russia in the beginning of the 21st century, one of the funniest things for me was, as an African American, the Russians said that, look, we have new art, we have new music. All African Americans rebelled against the white people and come from Harlem to Moscow. We'll pay your ticket. And so only a couple people took them up on that. Paul Robeson, I don't know, he went to Moscow and he said, yeah, Black Revolution, right? So
You got him in trouble for that, too.
Yeah,
right?
I got into extreme trouble. Or Claude McKay was an amazing African American poet. So they convinced a whole bunch of African Americans to leave Harlem and set up in Moscow. And it's one of those funnier moments. Yeah, it's like kind of, I like these kinds of quirky, paradoxical things. I mean, the book has yet to be written on that one, like Afro-modernism and Soviet revolutionary aesthetics. But how do we compare these different frames? And that's what I think this kind of the hidden elephant in the room right now is these kinds of quirky frames of reference where you just become enmeshed in the frame around it. You just move into the frame, but everybody else has their own little frame and has moved straight into that too. So the problem with 21st century realism, so to speak, is that you're just in an information cocoon. It's like the Matrix. And one of the beginning of the 21st century to me wasn't the Matrix film. It was the way that I finally stopped watching TV after 9/11. Because they kept repeating the same images all the time. Yeah, it drove me bonkers. And I said, you know what, I can't take it. So I started just getting everything from the web. And I was in Stockholm on 9/11, and the phones wouldn't work. I was calling friends in New York, and the TV just kept looping, the planes hitting the image, the TV, the kind of the towers and stuff. So I said, you know what, I can't get anything real off of this. And the only way I could get a feel of the intensity of what was going on was to go on the web. And a friend of mine, Tony Orso, you probably know Tony, had set up those cameras facing the World Trade Center and was streaming. And this is very early, sort of crude, webcam. But I was like, what the hell is going on? And you couldn't find out what was going on. The telephones weren't working. They just kept looping this annoying image of the plane hitting. And I got to the point where I just said, you know what, I'm going to turn everything off. I'm going to walk outside. And it was a beautiful day in Stockholm, and the whole city was a ghost town because everyone was watching the loops of TV. It was very eerie, like all the pubs, the Swedish, they're very, sort of pleasant form, sort of relaxed people. But the whole city was watching these loops of TV everywhere I went. I was like one of the only people on the street walking around. It was one of the first times I felt I'm watching the wrong channel of reality here or something, like this strange, everyone kept focused on the sort of media trance. Anyway, that's something that just came up in my mind after hearing the dialogue.
David, one of the things that seems to have emerged, and to kind of coalesce some of these ideas, but it seems a direction here. Originally, you were talking about appropriation, but there seems to be the notion that in art, what you're doing in your novel, and what you've been talking about, the creation of these personae, that doesn't really matter if you create them like Hitchcock did it in Vertigo. You have a character he falls in love with someone who doesn't exist, and that's the prototype of what you can manufacture things, and there's a certain reality to the factitious character.
But that's what Sigmund Freud was talking about with the uncanny.
Yes.
I mean, no, if you go back to the root,
right.
To me, the uncanny was one of the formative psychological issues of the 20th century, is assigning too much value to impersonal objects. If you look at the E.T.A. Hoffman short story, The Sandman, that Freud was but he also was applying that to the idea of walking through a city and being unfamiliar with it. So the city's landscape became an unscripted space, and he kept looping back. So the character kind of keeps encountering the same urban phenomena. And I love the idea of Freud and the Unheimlich as a 20th century sort of hidden theme, because if you think about how many people have responded to like the media phenomenon of Iraq, that's to me totally uncanny. The way they never found one weapon of mass destruction, not even a hint of one, and people, the right-wing Republicans and so on, they're still going, like as if it's this kind of, like when you hear Sarah Palin or any of the kind of bizarre right-wing rescripting. It's exactly what Hitler was doing during the burning of the Reichstag and creating this kind of notion of fear and terror as a narrative frame, and we're still there. It's not much different.
Did you say you were about to say something?
No, I was just thinking, I thought Freud was referring to the vagina in the uncanny.
No, he did it.
Excellent. Now there's the point of view.
Right? As far as I can recall, a lot of it was about him walking around and dealing with the city and the urban landscape.
No, it has very much to do with the feeling of uncanny, an unusual feeling that you get.
Yeah,
at the bottom of it, it has to do with the male's reaction to seeing the vagina.
Okay.
Well, on that
I think it's a good place to...
arousing point, we shall turn to questions.
Yes.
And wanted to open things up. I really, we've obviously just scratched the surface of this topic, and I wanted to, in the last 25 or 30 minutes, open the platform up to people to allow people in the audience to try to engage with the questions that we've tried to explore. And if people would like to ask apparently relatively brief questions, and to ask questions, and we'll try to respond.
Just come up to the mic and say who you are, because we'd like to know who you are.
Now everyone's shy.
Or do they have to come to the microphone?
Yes, because otherwise we can't no one recorded. Here. Okay. Because there are people downstairs. It won't be real. And we're recording.
I didn't want to be first, but nobody else got up. My name is Larry Cutler. I'm retired. I read two books lately. One is Billy Martin by this Falcon, and the other one is I'm reading Gravity's Rainbow by Pynchon. They're a little different, but it's a question of the real and interpretation. Now, on the Billy Martin book, he writes about Billy, what a great manager he is, and his alcoholism, and how he continually makes great teams, has these fights, and winds up dead. And what came into my mind was, because I agreed that he was a great manager, although the author didn't seem to say all things why, is the story could have been different. The way he puts it about Martin is his interpretation. In other words, can't the reader have a different interpretation of what Billy Martin was like? It doesn't have to be necessarily that is the way he was. And also, although he has a reason why he said he was great. Now, on the question of Pynchon, I understand where he talks about the joining of forces of the Nazis in 1945 and the United States, and this search for this weapon of destruction, and how it changes, from what it was before. And on these things I can understand. And then he talks about the main character, Slothrop, who is heading straight for destruction, which I don't see why. Now, does the real have to be what Pynchon says it is, because he's going to become insane, this person, why do I have to feel that he has to be insane? Also, the fact, he does use these terms like every time he has sex, right after that comes the rocket bombs, which hit parts of England. So, of course, that's metaphorical, So the question is, isn't the real how we interpret it, although what this Republican said is really nonsense, which Cheney said also. We are creating reality, which of course they're not. The reality is what it is. There are no weapons of mass destruction, even though there's a lot of lies going on, because, I could go into what Paul Robeson was about too, which is not what you said, but that's okay too. Anyway, I'd like this whole question of the reader is an artist too, in a sense, or should be, in terms of how. Yeah, my question is too long. I admit that, but this question of interpretation and reality.
What is question?
I asked Mr. Moody because I'm very impressed what he had to say.
I think there should be no limit on interpretation. The reader is free to interpret the text in any way that he or she chooses, and that's how it should be.
Same goes for visual art.
And the same goes for visual art. And I think Gravity's Rainbow is too complicated to get into in the context of this reply, but I'd be happy to afterwards.
I think it's crucial for me I think this fellow might have been a plant that Rick Moody planted this guy, because we're comparing a book about Billy Martin to Gravity's Rainbow. I'm not interested in nonfiction as either straightforward scholarship or straightforward journalism. I'm interested in nonfiction as work that aspires to the highest reaches of literary art. Specifically in this way, work that defines nonfiction upward. You remember Daniel Patrick Moynihan many years ago talking about defining democracy downward. I'm interested in defining nonfiction upward. I'm not under some naive illusion that nonfiction somehow has unique access to, quote, the real. Rather, I'm interested in nonfiction, great works of literary art, that by the virtue of that odd prefix, non, before the fiction, foreground the very notion of what's real. That is to say, part of the reason I wrote this book, Reality Hunger, was that the whole discussion of nonfiction contemporary culture is incredibly pedestrian and completely driven by a journalistic frame. Every work of nonfiction gets vetted according to whether it scans as journalism, whereas the great nonfiction can be viewed as a subset of literature, and that the works of nonfiction I really love and want to espouse in film, in literature, use nonfiction as a trampoline off which to bounce into the most serious epistemological questions. That is to say, what's knowledge? What's real? What's memory? What's a self? What's the other? What can we know? That's nonfiction to me, not a biography about Billy Martin. I mean, that's what I'm interested in, is nonfiction. The very illusion of a work of nonfiction is an incredibly exciting way to make the investigation matter and have a kind of resonance. And the reason that I'm so passionate about the topic is that fiction has a poetics going back millennia. Poetry has a poetics going back millennia. And nonfiction writers are still working to articulate that aesthetic, and I'm a part of that movement.
Great question.
Touching on what was just said in a way, it still astounds me. Edward Bernays, who's considered the father of advertising, in 1928 wrote a book called Propaganda. He turns out to be Sigmund Freud's American nephew, who took all of Freud's ideas 20 years before they were published in English and sold them to big business, politics, and the powers that be. All about it was called Engineering Consent. It was Goebbels, one of Goebbels' favorite books. It's all about keeping people in eternal infancy. And I was wondering if in any of these ideas about the role of the artist, you know, the curse of the age to me is like nobody grows up in this country. To what does growing up, becoming an adult have to do with art? And do you think that might be a subject that an artist might want to have something to do with?
That's a great, there's a really good film about Edward Bernays that came out a while back, and the psychopathical kind of relationship to Freud and so on. I'm a huge fan of how kind of eerily evil he was, I guess. And he was also good friends with Robert Moses, who ended up using some of his ideas of, again, scripting New York when they were doing all of the Cross Bronx Expressway and the erasure of neighborhoods in New York. So they needed to sell the destruction of certain aspects of New York. Which actually, the Cross Bronx Expressway is one of the most destructive interventions in New York, but it actually led to hip-hop. So a lot of the kids, the parks were being destroyed, and there's a great book by Trisha Rose called Black Noise, where she traces urban planning to some of the psychological stuff that conversations between Edward Bernays and Robert Moses, and the idea of the city as a kind of environment where people would seek to claim the tension between public space and private expression, which I think, personally, by the way, the gentleman who asked that last question, I'm a huge fan of Paul Robeson, and he got blacklisted and all sorts of stuff out of going to the Soviet Union, and so it couldn't work. Yeah, it couldn't work for a long time. But in terms of black avant-garde, he's a very important figure.
Great.
Okay, so. By the way, just as a kind of riff on that, I had bought what I like to call something relating to what one of my favorite writers, Marcel Mauss, and another writer, Lewis Hyde, like to call The Gift. So I wanted to invoke that before we wrap up by giving everybody a trace of the discussion. And Emil Durkheim was Marcel Mauss's mentor. If you can just take one and pass it along. And he liked to call this idea of the gift as a kind of social fact, or le fait social. If you want to just take a couple. And if you could pass these to some of the people on the other side. And I'll just hold them back just in case everybody. But how each of us has brought something to the discussion today is part of the gift economy. And when you're talking about Bernays, what people exactly are searching for is how to monetize these kinds of transactions. And that's where you get to this idea of, my nickname for it is sort of transactional realism. If you think about the corporate colonization of the subconscious, which is, there's a great magazine called Adbusters that deals with some of the issues that you're kind of riffing on. Personally, I think it's one of the best magazines going these days. Do you ever read Adbusters?
I do know Adbusters, yeah. I guess to speak to his question about adults, I guess for me, a part of the gesture I'm interested in is that this is maybe a little too easy, but that we live in a world of such artificial simulation that I do believe that we, at this particular time, crave the real, as elusive as the real is. And that what I personally, just sort of my aesthetic, my little hobby horse, is that I seem to think that the work that most can reach us, our work is work.
Do you guys get
There's extra. Don't worry about it. They're here. But by the way, Dave, I mean, but don't you think, in terms of what the gentleman's question was, reality is sold back to us at this point. It's a very big market, and the whole notion of making you feel slightly at an angle to the marketable realism of this economy is what I think is one of the major issues of the information economy. We're no longer an industrialized nation in the same definition of 19th or 20th century, forget Satan's Mills and all this kind of stuff of Blake. But somehow the economy needs to continuously look for the sensation of the new. And reality is a big market. I mean, there's definitely an economic function going on here. And Bernays was really one of the first to conceptualize this sort of mass transition of monetizing the imagination. Him at Disney, I think.
Perversion, though.
Yeah, but
constantly talking about in relation to Freud, and it's really perverse.
But I mean, if you look at what Walt Disney did around same time, I mean, you can easily. Those are two of the major early kind of bizarre. Anyway, let's go to part two. Yeah.
My name is Kitty, and I'm an intellectual property lawyer. And I guess I just wonder, don't we have to draw the line somewhere? Yeah. Because one thing that is the reality, as some of the artists who are here today, the reality is that you all enjoy manipulating reality, some of you, and taking other people's reality and manipulating that for your own pleasure of creation. But I just want to ask that question. Don't we have to draw the line somewhere? Ripping off other people's stuff and even their image and using their image, which happens all the time. I wonder what you think about that.
Only if we want to make a living.
I mean, I would say, go ahead.
It's fun because I didn't used to know a lot of lawyers, and suddenly I find myself talking to a lot of lawyers, and intellectual property is one of the issues. I'm also dealing with, this is all totally new terrain to me, rights of publicity, which is benefiting. So when I had this idea that maybe I could ask Paul or Zizek or other people to say, I don't know your characters. It seemed like it wasn't really going to happen. So then I had this other idea, which was that I was going to go to the web and I was going to find some interviews with some of these people, like Bjork, that were already on the public record. And Bjork saying in an email interview, I always feel I say too much. I thought maybe I could quote that as though she were trying to be discreet about my character, but I could give the source so that anybody could go and find a trace. They could figure out that Bjork wasn't really talking about my characters. And then a lawyer said to me, you have to worry about rights of publicity because you'll be benefiting from the celebrity status of this person. You'll be for personal gain because somehow you'll be, And it got very complicated. And I wrote to one of the big lawyers in that field because it's a developing field because this is fairly new. And then I also started I met somebody else who's an expert in, and you probably know all about this, droit moral, moral rights, which is a totally new branch of the law.
None of this is that new.
Not that new, but it's changing really fast. So a moral right is if you make a painting and I buy it and I own the painting, I can't draw a mustache on it, even if I own it, because I will be compromising your artistic vision, which is super complicated. So
if you buy it, you can.
Well, no. You're telling me I can, so I guess then that makes it conceptual art. So we've agreed as collaborators that we can, but there is all kinds of legal complications around that, which is very weird because there's a whole history of people. As anybody who's an art historian, it goes on so.
Hold on. In the same time,
it's total madness. Total madness. But okay, and then I don't know if you how many people are familiar with the Chapman brothers who took the Goya etchings and doodled all over them, which is something that I find. I love Goya. I love the Chapman brothers doodles all over the Goya, and I would fight to the death for their right to be able to doodle on those Goyas that I love so much. But it's gotten very, very complicated. I don't know.
So let's put it this way: when you were saying you rip off, you were pointing to me kind of gesturally. So.
I didn't especially mean just
Okay, sure. No, but I enjoy the idea of sort of being irreverent of copyright law. I mean, the copyright law as it's written, people need to update their business model and mental kind of headspace about ideas of network communities. And the idea of, again, the reason why I'm evoking a gift economy is precisely because copyright law was pretty much written for an era of physical goods. And the way that the economy is shifting to dematerialization of almost all aspects and of every possible creative endeavor, you got to remember, it's a very skewed game. The corporations usually set up copyright law to extend the rights and so on until infinite, ad infinitum. The Bono copyright law to me was a joke. It's unenforceable.
Copies can't be controlled any longer.
Yeah, forget
they're
exactly.
completely
go to China and tell them about copies. I mean, it's the whole notion of moral rights versus the ownership of any aspect of text or sound or media or software. It needs to be rescripted, revised, and somehow, some way, there needs to be an update. I don't know how, because I think...
Or a backdate.
Well, kids are growing...
We all work with the voices of other authors in our heads.
I think sampling's more honest. It's just as...
sampling is just a form of acknowledging, the reality of creativity. We don't create out of vacuums. We have a constant stream of other voices that run through us. Whether I take an image from another... writer, another illustrator or photographer, and take a little bit and stick it into the work, the fact that I put a lot of bits of that somehow or another is akin to the way one would create if it just came out of the neurons of your brain. It's not a whole lot different to me. It's just the material of how we create, how we've always created, whether we take a physical manifestation or a vestigial image, or whether we have a thought of the image that we would then imply into the work.
Exactly. I mean, Shakespeare's Henry VI, 2/3 of it is essentially ripped from Plutarch's Lives. 350 years later, Sherry Levine rephotographs a Walker Evans photograph and calls it her work. To plagiarize is to create. It has always been such and will always be such.
And there's a great essay, just a tiny little thread here, that I had Jonathan Lethem do a remix of. He did a piece in Harper's where every piece in the essay is taken from other works. I really enjoyed Jonathan's blurb on your book, by the way. It was great. Jonathan's a great writer, really interesting. But in context of, I know she was an intellectual property lawyer. I tracked down the senior legal counsel to Google when I was putting my book Sound and Bound together, and I had her do an essay. It was kind of a collision, because all of these social networks like Facebook, MySpace, and so on, they all have little hidden claimers about owning the pictures and sounds and everything that you post. So people, even when they're dead, some people have left their Facebook tombstone, for committing suicide and leaving a trace of them, their words and various stuff. It's got to be, I think, viewed in the context that these are historical perspectives at this point. It's old news. Kids are growing up way past this idea of a very narrow straitjacket of copyright law. It's totally unenforceable.
Let's let some of your questions, yeah.
But can I just say one thing? I mean, the unforeseeable situation that in all this democratization of influence is that ultimately corporations like Google are now the new information owners. And that, like, in a funny, like Jared Lanier has been talking about, You Are Not a Gadget. He's talking about how we are now just content providers for the corporate entities. And so, in a funny way, it's like the individual artists, in a funny way, are losing their ability to control their copies, but the corporations that manage these networks are now in control. And that's the
you talked about that here a little bit.
Yeah, no, and it's the downside of this democratization. It's not really that democratic.
Exactly.
It has become another corporatized situation, and they are in fact becoming the billionaires.
No, I totally agree.
And whereas like a guy like Jared Lanier can't even hang out with this kid anymore. He's got to be on the road, constantly appearing in person because he can't sell records. He's not getting paid for his articles. So the only time he can actually get paid is by being a real person in real space, and that's a sad fact of this new economy.
But actually, it's
we should let very patient.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah,
sure. I had a question for John specifically. I was wondering, working with the actors on Short Bus, like negotiating the creation of their characters. Because they come to you from like a very personal place, it sounds like, and then you kind of dramatize from that. And there are like a lot of directors who like to play at being a psychologist, and it seems like you try to really avoid that with the work. I was just wondering if you could riff on that.
Well, some directors have worked that way, or theater people, and it becomes a bit of a cult. So I really wanted them to be... I always told them, I never want to make you do something you don't want to do, but I want you to challenge yourselves in the story, sexually as well as emotionally, which was more difficult for them, the emotional part, so that we can challenge the audience's view of stuff. And it was interesting that we had that amount of time because we really could come to a true collaborative situation where I was sort of I still had a kind of final say, but there was sometimes where they tried too hard to be themselves. When the script would be written, they would try to recreate things too well, and I had to keep reminding them to keep it real. And one way of doing that was to let it to always be changing while we were rehearsing, while we were shooting. And I said, you still have to do those lines as written, those as beats, but I'll fire you if you say the lines the same way twice. So every take had to be new, paraphrased, or I'd throw in a new, curveball to sort of knock them off of their pace. And that was the part that was perhaps the spontaneous thing, the mistake, when your guitar string is one of them's out of tune, and that's the beauty of the accident and the moment. And that way of working allowed us to sort of stay on the fence of real and not real, and also remind them that they weren't their characters, But it took a long time to do that. They were also collaborators in terms of if we ever made a profit, which the companies who distributed it did, but we never did. The company went under. But I never expect anything. I don't expect to get Social Security. I never expect anything later, and that, which has probably kept me fairly sane, because I could have been in lawsuits for the rest of my life. But it was all about, I always reminded them, the final film is not your life, it's the making of the film. So let's make sure we have a good time, make sure that we're trusting each other and loving each other while we're doing it. I mean, that was. But I just wanted to talk about this other thing. There's something really interesting happening. I was just reading here that one of DJ Spooky's collaborations here is featuring George W. Bush as probably a vocalist. But Bush to me, in a some kind of idiot savant way, was somehow able to accept the way things are in terms of digital culture and the explosion of mass movements, or the impossibility of mass movements, to do what he wanted to do. He was this weird kind of, unconscious theorist who was able to apply how everything's changing to do what he wanted to do.
Well, semiotics isn't part of the left wing anymore.
No, it's like whether he understood it directly or not. And somehow I understood that for the first time when someone I know who directed many of the X-Men movies was telling me the story of coming back from Korea on Korean Air in the first class, and there was just 4 people in first class, basically 3 and their assistants, maybe 6 people. And he said, I had this conversation with somebody, this weird thing that happens in a plane where you might be open to talking to someone you never would have met. Talked to him for 5 hours, great times, guys from Texas. It was George Bush. And I said, you're talking to George Bush for 5 hours. And he was in first class. You were both doing gigs in Korea. Well, what did you talk about? Well, I understood why everybody really liked him and, worked with him and tried to get him to be where he needed to be. And I really liked him too. And I was like, really? He was like, yeah, did you challenge him on anything? No, it's because everyone was really nice. And, my assistant, who was a member of Young Jewish Straight Men Against Bush in college, here's a picture of him and George Bush smiling. And then he showed me video, because Bush got up and talked to everyone in first class for a long period of time, and what are you up to, and what do you do, and the Korean dentist, and he was quite gregarious. Yeah, he was a politician, and he was a great guy. And then he said everyone started videotaping all of this. George Bush talking to this person, and this filmmaker showed me this tape where the camera is panning from King Kong, which is playing on a giant screen, with someone like screaming, and then over to Bush reading on his Kindle in this beautiful top light, and then panning over to my friend's assistant who's going, it's George Bush, and then back to Bush, and it was the most brilliant film I saw all year. And then Bush talking to the Korean dentist who was really more interested in the X-Men director. And Bush was, he sort of sensed that this director was gay, and made kind of a friendly joke about the gays. It's like, let's introduce our assistants. Maybe they could have sex, And he's like, I'm going to go take a nap now. Do you want an Ambien? George said to Brian, my friend, and Brian's like, I'm actually off the Ambien now. But he's like, well, I've been using it for years. And it keeps me on schedule. And Brian is not a particularly political person, but he didn't really challenge him on a lot of stuff, except Iran or something came up with Iran. But he just wanted to listen, and I suddenly saw why this guy, he understood all of it, or how things work at least, and in his friendly way, got his way, and is still quite. He sensed was at peace with it all.
Yeah, he's totally on autopilot.
Let's have time for one last question.
Well, my question might be slightly latent, because my question is, I'm a huge fan of Fred's and Paul's, and in this era of democracy and democratization of ideas, I really wanted to know where in the process is your own gratification, and is it at all diluted by this new era? And I'm wearing an optimism pin, so I feel like I'm a little bit of a rebel at the Psychoanalytic Institute. But
why?
And my book is it's from.
He wants to know why you feel that's a rebellious.
You're supposed to be pessimistic.
It's not the pessimistic.
Well, it's just it's not. I'm not sure if it's real or not. So.
Vaginas make us happy. But what was the?
Where in your process is there an element of gratification, and is it at all diluted by this era of blurred identities and ideas? And since we now have a gift, maybe that's, I don't know if that's gratifying for you, but it is for all of us, too.
But I mean, there's, my work is partially is an attempt to kind of wrestle with this sort of landscape of the unreal that has shaped my consciousness. I've said that maybe I have said in the past that maybe the unreality is the realest thing there is, and I've been trying to find the real in all of that, and since I started my project in the mid '80s, it seems like the world has developed an ever increasingly large menu of reality modification endeavors, and so it sort of seems that my work at this point is just sort of trying to sort of stay apace with the way the world continues to manifest these sort of hyper-real or meta sort of spaces. And but the weird thing is that in this age of feral copies, when I make a thing, it's a real thing. Like, and even though I'm making it out of this sort of ephemera of the of web culture, I am sort of grabbing bits out of the hive cloud mind and throwing them into the work. There is this sort of, surface quality, tactility, scale, and the hundreds of love hours that I, as an individual, have put into the object that can't be replicated as a copy itself. Like, a real thing has to be seen in order for the real experience to occur. So, in a funny way, I guess that's my gratification, are these real things that exist in this very unreal process.
And I'll sort of respond as well. For me, one of the best parts of doing music, and different from writing or doing my artwork, is getting out of the studio. I'm in the studio all the time making tracks and doing production and editing film, because it's all software. You're sitting, it's inescapable that I spend several hours a day in front of my laptop or home editing system and so on. The best gratification for me is forgetting all of that and, 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning with a crowd and feeling the sense of music wherever you are, and how electronic music, one of the beautiful things about it is that it's imminently elusive. And when I say imminently elusive, it's like, say for example, if the government's going to take your house, it's called imminent domain. They'll crash it, so on. But imminence, it's about putting back out. It's. I love the idea of everyone looking at music as this kind of most elusive emotional thing, whatever that is. Music's language, it's storytelling, it's the meta kind of structure, I think, of human creative process. You can be out at a party and have some kind of transcendent moment or whatever. My nickname for it's the prolonged present. Like, the best feeling is like you've been at a great concert or a beautiful theater piece or an amazing DJ set, and you've lost track of time. You realize it's 5 in the morning instead of like midnight or something like that. That kind of fugue, for lack of a better word, is where I get my gratification. And you go to the root of something like dilettante, it's just dilectios, or amateur, which also traces straight right back into the root word of love. Loving a process or a project or anything implies letting go, or at least to me, how I have to deal with a lot of different styles of people, with DJ culture, with writing, with music and art. Each of them has its own gravity wells that can easily pull you into this kind of, what's the French term, mise en abîme, a kind of infinite corridor of mirrors where you have to deal with all the politics, all the different weird things about getting a work done, getting it out. Music is probably the most visceral and centered and direct connection I can get with other people. And that's where I think, you just let everything go and people exist there in that moment, in that spot, whether it's a concert, club, or whatever.
Thank you very much.